So our discussant for this session is Gary Fulford.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. For those that I haven't met, I'm Rick Fulford. I'm with PIMCO. I run our defined contribution business. I first of all want to thank the Pension Council for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to contribute. I've got the distinct honor of being amongst such a distinguished group of researchers. I'm not a researcher myself, so go easy on me. I'm a business guy. I've also got the distinct honor, I suppose, of standing in front of you guys getting to a drink and a reception after this session, so bear with me. Both papers I thought were absolutely terrific. I'm going to share with you my own perspectives on them, the things that stood out to me as being particularly interesting and or insightful. And perhaps I'll suggest a few areas that may have implications for further research. So first I'll start with Lori's paper, The Nightmare on Main Street, and the focus on the mortgage market and the subprime crisis and the debt crisis. A couple of things that stood out to me. One, the mortgage debt levels for folks in retirement increased dramatically in the 20 years leading up to the crisis. For the 65 to 74-year-old cohort, you saw about 100% increase in debt. For those 75 plus and older, you saw a four-fold increase in debt, so dramatic. Now that's very distinct from what we heard earlier today with respect to the Japanese market. Now the reason for that, of course, is a number of things. We saw home prices go up pretty dramatically, much more easy access to financing across all segments of the population. And of course, we saw home ownership increase pretty dramatically over those years as well. The other thing I think is pretty interesting is the default experience in the subprime market was so dramatic relative to the prime market. And that's not to say that things weren't bad in the prime market either. But to give you a sense, the subprime market experienced 5 times the levels of defaults relative to the prime market. And I think it highlights a couple things. One, it highlights the lack of underwriting standards at the time. Clearly, there were folks being given credit that probably shouldn't have been. It wasn't in their best interest to get that credit. And they may have been better off renting, as a speaker earlier spoke to. The other thing I think it highlights is that the originators of these loans were not necessarily focused on creating good loans that would last or be in the market. They were concerned and interested in creating fees for their organizations, knowing that they could in turn package these loans, securitize them, sell them off into the marketplace with no further liability. It was also interesting to see that the most vulnerable groups were some of the ethnic minorities, of course. African Americans, Hispanics, they had default rates in just looking at prime at roughly 2 times their white counterparts. I mean, we know that the housing market and the crisis affected literally everybody in the economy that had a house, but it had a significant impact on the elderly as well. Part of the reason for that, I think, is, and as was described in the paper, is older folks are on a fixed budget. They tend to have less income. They tend to have a set of fixed expenses. They don't have the flexibility to adapt to such a financial shock. And as you look at the 75-year-olds over the period of this study, you found 2 things happen. Number one, their income dropped by about 5% over that 4-ish year period. And at the same time, all of their housing-related expenses went up dramatically. Right? If you look at mortgage interest expense went up 16%, property taxes up 5%, utilities up 5%, not even considering things like healthcare, which were also up north of 5%. So you can imagine how that financial situation flipped pretty quickly. It was also interesting to see that those that were 50 plus years old that were most vulnerable, not surprisingly, were in the lowest income cohorts. In fact, nearly 60% of those defaulting had household income levels south of $75,000, which I would argue speaks to the importance, we've talked a lot about debt, but I think it also speaks to the importance of savings and contributing to retirement savings plans. I think it also speaks to the importance of some of the legislation that hopefully makes its way through our Congress in terms of broadening the scope of people that have access to plans, either through state-sponsored plans, open MEPs, et cetera. To the extent there had been more savings leading into the crisis, perhaps these individuals wouldn't have needed things like home equity loans, which partially got them into trouble. The last thing I found really interesting was the impact on real human issues. Obviously, if as an individual that's gone through a foreclosure or you're delinquent on your payments, it has pretty significant social stigma attached to that. And there's clear linkages to true health issues that people then experience, whether it's depression, anxiety, suicide rates higher. We heard earlier, and that was confirmed here as well, that you end up seeing a correlation between those events and a cutback on spending on basic human necessities, right? Food, prescription drugs, and others. In terms of things to think about looking forward, I would be really interested to know, which of the factors of the mortgage market in particular were the most pernicious in terms of leading to this outcome. Perhaps that would be interesting research for policymakers as we seek to ensure that predatory practices against all of us in society are limited, but certainly against the older populations. The other thing that I think is more of a question than, and it's not clear exactly to me how you would do research in this area, but I think it's interesting, which is how do we find the right balance between consumer protections and access to capital? I mean, I think ultimately that's what we're talking about. Whom do we need to protect from themselves in terms of gaining access to capital, which then sets them up poorly for retirement? Of course, that informs policymaking as well. That's all I had for that paper. Let me switch to the second paper. I also found this one really interesting. The first piece that really jumped out to me, and Bob pointed to this in the beginning, which is to say there's not been a lot of work done on public sector employees and how they spend income and or draw down assets in retirement. But it was interesting when you look at this population, you realize this is a really well-insured population, right? This is a group that has access to at least a large number of sources of income, perhaps relative to others in society, right? Most of them had a pension benefit. As I looked at the tables that were compiled in the study, that represented between 35 and 40% of their annual income, so a meaningful number. They had access to retiree health insurance after they had left their roles. More than 65% were already taking Social Security. Nearly 90% of those in the study had access to a supplemental retirement plan. And 30 to 40% of all of those individuals had taken a second job in retirement. So if this group was in financial distress, which I think they showed, I worry a lot more about the non-public employees in the low-income brackets. The other thing I found really interesting was we all know well this generational shift that's occurring from DB plans to DC plans, and of course with that you're having greater and greater responsibility fall into the hands of individuals, whether it be for savings or figuring out how to draw down their assets. And the implication is that there's much greater propensity for the financial mistakes that were highlighted, whether it's mistakes related to savings, whether it's related to drawdown of assets, whether it's related to the assumption of debt, and a whole host of other questions that are important as people hit retirement. One of the financial mistakes that the research focuses on that jumped out to me, and it relates to other research I've seen recently, which is to say, it seems that a number of individuals are not viewing their supplemental retirement plans or their DC plans as sources of liquid wealth that they can tap into in times of stress. And the research showed this, right? There was this propensity of people to, they may have large balances or balances in their retirement plan, yet they maintain meaningful balances in credit card debt or other forms of debt that may have higher levels of interest. In other words, it seems clear that there's a meaningful human bias not to draw down the balances in your retirement plans. Interestingly, the research showed that lower income folks did draw down their balances a bit more than higher income folks. And I suspect that's related to these are people that are in simply more extreme need. As an aside, there's a study that Lori Lucas and team have done at EBRI that I think is pretty interesting and related, which looks at spending patterns and drawdown of balances in retirement plans, and you find a similar result. People tend not to draw down their balances over time. And contrary to public opinion, the people that drew down their balances the least were those that also had pension income, right? You'd think if you had a steady stream of pension income, you might feel a little more comfortable about drawing down assets. In fact, it was quite the opposite. So perhaps there's a link between the extremity of an individual's need and their willingness to draw down assets. One other financial mistake that was referenced in the study, but not gone into in detail, but I do think is interesting, is the Social Security election. It was clear looking at the data and the tables that this is not a decision that's being optimized by many, but in particular, it's not being optimized by people who are either low income or single. I suspect that's because these are the individuals who are least able to live on their financial assets in order to defer. But I found that interesting. Again, human behavior having a big impact here. The literature speaks to the strong correlation between financial literacy and potentially making mistakes. So I thought it was interesting to highlight those elements of the study that are most vulnerable, meaning those that are more or less financially literate. Turns out married households are much more financially literate than single. Higher income households are more literate than lower income households. Lower income households in this study were generally defined, or most often defined, as single women with low educational attainment. So clearly some implications there for greater support for that group. It was also interesting to see the financial literacy assessments. Some of the research that was highlighted in the early part of the study, not done by this group, but referenced. One was the fact that retirees 65 plus years old have the highest level of reported financial literacy, yet they're most likely to get two of the questions from earlier studies incorrect. And those two questions being the impact of inflation and the impact of compounding within portfolios. So obviously two very critical components to understanding your personal finances. Last point I thought was pretty interesting was the factor, when you look at the correlations that related to financial distress, one that stood out was whether or not you knew the dollar balance of your retirement plan. It turns out that those individuals that didn't know the balance of their retirement plan tended to have trigger more factors of financial distress. They tended to have credit card balances, they tended to get behind on their bills, and they tended to indicate an inability to come up with $2,000 in the coming 30 days. Okay, so in terms of areas for potential research, one thing I personally find very interesting that I think ties very much to this and may be helpful for many parts of our industries is gaining a better understanding of the cognitive and behavioral biases that lead people to spend primarily from income and loathe to draw down balances of accounts. What are the motivations for doing that? Why don't they want to draw down their assets either to improve their standard of living in retirement or to do, as some have suggested, to pay down higher interest-bearing levels of debt? Is it because there's a desire to self-insure? Maybe that's true, right? They're worried about future expenses. Is it because they have a lack of distribution flexibility, which we know is true in many DC plans across the US? Is it behavioral, mental accounting, or other things? There may be good insights there. And then last thing I'd suggest is it would be great to see research that tested the viability of specific financial literacy programs and their ability to actually change human behavior and help to avoid some of these financial mistakes. Sorry about that. Obviously, that would have implications for the advice that we provide to people. It would have implications for plan sponsors, consultants, et cetera. With that, thank you.